Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel. This is the Giffen Guide to March Madness. I'm Nick Giffen, predictive analyst here at Action Network, and I'm here to talk you through a fun way to bet March Madness. I've used this system for several years to have just a fun sweat, and this system is designed to have plenty of upside in your betting results while limiting your losses to a manageable 2 units. All while getting to sweat plenty of underdogs during the tournament. I mean, who doesn't love a good underdog story, right? So let's get into the overview of this system, and then I will give you my 8 picks for this year's Giffen Guide to March Madness. All right, so let's start with a little explainer. And the way I'm going to do this is, let's imagine we're flipping a coin, right? A coin has a 50-50 outcome. A fair coin has a 50-50 outcome. So let's put $25 on each coin flip. If you treat the NCAA tournament kind of like a series of coin flips, then if you bet a $25 bet on an even money team versus another team, if they win, you double that money, right? You'd win your $25 back plus the $25 you won for winning that. Then you'd have $50. And then let's flip another coin, right? So let's say we got heads and we won. Flip another coin and we get heads again. Then that $50 we bet now turns into $100. Well, if you do this every single time, it's called rolling it up or rolling over your winnings. If you rolled up your winnings every single time, plus your original bet on even money bets all the way through the tournament, your initial $25 investment would turn into $1,600 if your team won it all. Or, if you were to get several straight coin flips of heads in a row. So that's the idea here is, if you do that, that $25 turns into $1,600. That's 64-1 odds. So that number seems pretty nice. But suddenly, let's say we pick an underdog team. Then we're no longer getting even money, right? We're no longer flipping a fair coin. We're flipping a weighted coin. So if you get an underdog team through pretty far in the tournament, especially if they were to win it all, then all of a sudden you get much longer than 64-1 odds. And if you just bet that team's future to win the tournament, you would not get as good result just betting on their future as rolling up money line every game. Let's use an example from this year's tournament. So Iowa is an 8 seed in the Midwest, and currently they are even money versus the 9 seed Auburn to win that game. So if you bet $25 on Iowa and they win, you get your $25 back plus the $25 for winning even money against Auburn. Then they would likely be an underdog because their next game would probably almost surely be against number 1 seed Houston, barring a 116 upset there. So they'd likely be a significant underdog in their game against Houston. If they somehow won that, they're probably going to be an underdog in their Sweet 16 game, and so forth and so on. So if you get Iowa to win the national championship using this method, you're going to get much better than 80-1 to win it all because of the significant underdog they'll be, first of all, versus Houston, and then the underdog money you'll get as they get further and further in the tournament, as they face better and better teams as well. But just by betting their future right now, it is 80-1. So you're not getting as good of an investment on Iowa by betting them to win the national championship as you would be to just bet the money line and roll it up every game. Now, I use Iowa as an example here because they're not a team I'm picking. I do not recommend betting them in this system or as a future to win the national championship, but I wanted to give you an idea because it explains the system very well. They're a team that you're going to get at least even money on probably in every single game in this tournament. So by using this system, you get them much longer than 80-1 to win the tournament instead of betting their future at 80-1. So that's kind of the idea of this system, and I have used this system in 4 years in the past. In 2017, I was able to identify 11 seed Xavier, and they made it all the way to the Elite 8. In 2018, I got another 11 seed Loyola to the Elite 8, and that Loyola team actually ended up making it to the Final Four as well. I cashed out on them in the Elite 8, but they did make it to the Final Four. And then in 2019, I took the 5 seed Auburn, and they also made it to the Final Four. 2020 was the COVID year. 2021, I didn't really want to bet on because of all the craziness from COVID still going on with players missing and team, throughout the season. I felt like it didn't make my power ratings quite as accurate. So I sat out 2021 as well. Last year for 2022, unfortunately, obviously the system doesn't work every time. We won 1 out of the 9 games, right? We bet on 8 teams, and we did hit the play-in game with Indiana, but then they lost in the first round. So very bad year last year, but hey, that happens. At least we limit our losses to 2 units doing this system. So let's get into an overview in the system. How does it work? What exactly are we doing? For this system, we're going to pick 8 teams in this tournament. Ideally, these 8 teams that we pick are going to be 5 seed or higher. And it's even better, if they're beyond like an 8 seed or a 9 seed, because then we're going to typically get them at significant plus money odds on the money line in these games. So ideally, in a perfect world with a 64 team bracket, there are 8 eighths of the bracket. The top half and the bottom half of each region would give us 8 quadrants, not quadrants, 8 eighths of the bracket. So that way, if we get all 8 teams, to the Elite 8, they would finally face each other in the Elite 8 instead of beforehand. But that typically doesn't work out because there are certain brackets, certain eighths of the region that are much stronger than others where underdog value I don't find. So if we do pick 2 teams from the same eighth of the bracket where they would face each other before the Elite 8, we try to target them facing each other in the Sweet 16. And if we do get them to face each other in the Sweet 16, well, then that's great because we won in the first round. We won in the second round with both of those teams. So when they face each other, we can just cash out the profits there and essentially lock ourselves in to having at least a neutral betting system for this year, at least breaking even. So if that happens, that's totally fine. It's also likely that, one of those teams loses and we can still just roll one of these teams to the Elite 8 anyway if they get there. So the overall goal of this system is to guarantee a profit by getting one of our 8 teams into the Elite 8, or, is a backup circumstance to have 2 of our teams face each other and cash out those profits there. But the overall goal is to get just one. Just all we need is one Cinderella story, one team to make the Elite 8 out of our 8 picks, and that'll get us a profit, and sometimes potentially a very significant profit, depending on how much of an underdog that team is that gets to the Elite 8. So how do we do this? How do we go about identifying the 8 teams? Well, I use a bunch of metrics, and because, of course, at Action Network, I'm a predictive analyst, and I do a lot of different sports, I'm not going to do all the work myself. I'm going to let other people do the work for me. And what I mean by that is there are tons of computer or rating systems out there, right? A lot of the common ones are KenPom, for example. People will always reference KenPom. Well, what I do is, and I do include KenPom, is I build my own power rating system by ensembling the most predictive ranking systems together. So I'm not looking at ones that explain past wins well. Just because a team is, 28-2 doesn't mean they should be a 28-2 team. Maybe they've gotten very lucky with some of their wins. They've won a bunch of close ones, and then their losses were blowouts, or maybe it just depends on the strength of the schedule. So the idea is I'm taking the ones that are the most predictive, forward-looking, and ensembling them together. And then I'm adjusting those for injuries, right? Because certain teams may look really strong. Tennessee is an example from this year. They're a very strong team by ensembling ranking systems together, but they do have one of their best players out with injury. So I need to adjust them downward for injury. So I have a way of doing that as well. And by ensembling all of these predictive ranking systems together, what we do is we smooth out the rough edges in any one ranking system. So each ranking system will have its own blind spots, teams that they're too low on, teams that they're too high on. But by ensembling them together, the most predictive ones, we can get a nice, really accurate measurement of team strength. Then That's not just the only thing I use. I still want to dive into the particular matchups themselves. And one thing I love to do when I'm taking underdogs is I love to look at pace of play. Every team plays at their own pace, right? Alabama, they play at a breakneck speed. Virginia, they play at a slow, plodding pace. Well, what that means is when teams play at a slower pace, there are fewer overall possessions. And when that happens, all of a sudden, those teams that are favored have fewer possessions to assert their dominance, to assert their efficiency advantage, right? Just imagine a one possession game. You have the tip off and the first team to score wins. That would be almost a coin flip in nearly every game. So that goes to show why more possessions is better for a favored team, because they have more opportunities to assert their efficiency, but fewer possessions helps an underdog story. So that's definitely one of the things I will look at as well, aside from just power ratings. Another thing I like to look at is something that increases variance for an underdog, or for a favorite reduces variance. And some of those things could be 3-point shooting. If a underdog team is a particularly strong 3-point shooting team, or they're facing a particularly weak 3-point shooting defense, that may help us. Another thing that could be the situation would be foul trouble potential. Does the favored team have the potential to get into foul trouble and remove some of their best players? Or on the flip side, is the favored team a poor foul shooting team? And if they're ahead by a little bit late in the game, they start missing some of those free throws. That definitely gives a little bit of extra variance toward the underdog here. So these are just some of the metrics that I'm using when I'm trying to pick my 8 teams. The other thing is just looking at particularly this year, we have to look at the team. So using those metrics that I've looked at, we have some pretty tough sections of the bracket. And for me, the most challenging 1/8 of the bracket is the UCLA Gonzaga 8th of the bracket. UCLA should be a 1 seed, and Gonzaga should be a 2 seed by my power rating. So we have the strongest 2 seed and the strongest 3 seed in the same 8th of the bracket. And we don't have any particularly strong underdog teams in that 8th of the bracket. So I am avoiding that 8th of the bracket altogether. That means we need to double up somewhere else. So we will have a situation where we do double up in one of the regions. The other thing is there's another 8th of the bracket that I'm avoiding, and that is the Alabama 8th of the bracket as well. I mentioned their breakneck tempo. They are a tempo pushing team, and they're number 2 overall in my power ratings. And I know they got the number 1 overall seed. They probably should have been number 2 overall, but they got the number 1 overall seed. But that still means they're incredibly, incredibly good. So Alabama pushing the tempo, and Alabama, being a very strong team. It's a good section of the bracket to avoid. Now, there are some good 12 and 13 seeds in that 8th of the bracket. I mean, Furman versus Virginia. We mentioned Virginia's slow tempo. I think Furman has a good opportunity there. And Charleston, the 12 seed, has a good opportunity versus San Diego State. But I really like, that means I like their opportunity to make the elite, to make the Sweet 16. I don't like their opportunity to make the Elite 8 because they would probably almost surely be facing an up-tempo Alabama. There are also strong 8 and 9 seeds that Alabama could face in this region, but because they face each other as 2 very strong 8 and 9 seeds, it's hard to pick between Maryland and West Virginia here. So I'm just going to avoid that 8th of the bracket altogether, which means I need to double up again in another 8th of the bracket somewhere else. So I'll be picking 2 teams from another 8th of the bracket. So overall, 2 teams from 2 8ths of the bracket, which gives us 4 teams. And then the other 4 8ths of the bracket, I will have 1 team each. But even with one of those double ups, you'll see it actually works out kind of nicely because we will still avoid a potential Sweet 16 matchup because I will be picking one of those teams in a play-in game, which kind of helps there because we'll get into the details, but we don't necessarily have to get them to the Elite 8. We can get them to the Sweet 16. So before we get into my picks, I just want to remind you all, this is my system. These are my picks. You can tweak this any way you want. You can pick fewer teams. You can pick more teams, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend more than 8 getting to the Elite 8. But you don't have to tail my picks. You don't have to tail my exact teams. If you like certain teams for certain reasons, I'm totally for that. I've had a tough time picking a couple of these, and I'll talk about those situations that I think were pretty tough. And I would be very, very totally okay with you flipping and taking the other team in these spots. So these are just my 8 picks for the Giffen Guide to March Madness. So let's dive right in. We're going to start in the South region here. And as I mentioned, we're going to avoid Alabama's 8th of the bracket. So what that means is we're going to be doubling up on Arizona, the 2 seeds, 8th of the bracket here. And we're going to start with Creighton, the 6th seed in the South. My power ratings love Creighton. They say Creighton should be a borderline 3 to 4 seed if you just line up all the 68 teams in this tournament, right? They're around the 12th or the 13th best team in my power ratings in this tournament. So that would put them ordinarily, if you just seeded the teams off my power ratings, as a borderline 3 or 4 seed here for Creighton. So at a 6 seed, people often look at that number. Betting markets even often look at that number and will adjust to that because that's where the public money tends to come in on. So the fact that they should be a 3 or 4 seed, but they're a 6 seed, we probably can get them at some good underdog money in the later rounds. But in that first round, they do face NC State. My Wolfpack, I went to grad school at NC State, so just a little note there. I have no bias in these picks because I am picking against my Wolfpack in the very first pick of the Giffen Guide to March Madness. Now, NC State is a great 11 seed matchup for Creighton. NC State has not had many good wins this year. Their best win is against Duke, but it was at home. On the road or a neutral site, they do not have any top 100 wins. So not looking particularly elite here for NC State. The other thing is NC State is a bit up tempo, which is good for the favored team, which is Creighton. Of course, Creighton, the 6 seed versus the 11 seed, and Creighton, one of my strongest teams for a 6 seed, the strongest 6 seed. The more possessions they have, the better it is for their efficiency advantage to set in. So I love the matchup here versus NC State. I love the up-tempo pace. So I think they definitely get it done versus NC State. In the second round, Baylor is the 3 seed in their 8th of the bracket, and they would end up facing Baylor if Baylor wins. But I have Creighton and Baylor literally back-to-back in my power rankings. So I mentioned, right, that Creighton should be a borderline 3-4 seed. Well, Baylor is also a borderline 3-4 seed for me. So Baylor, just because of the number and just because of the public perception, Baylor will probably be favored by odds makers, but I have this game as a true coin flip. So we can get Creighton here at plus money, which will help us for that rolling it up kind of method here, the system. So if they make it past Baylor or whoever they face there, then Creighton is in the Sweet 16, and if things all go according to plan, they would face Arizona as the 2 seed. But per my power rankings, Arizona is more like a mid 3 seed team. So my power rankings literally have Arizona, St. Mary's, Baylor, and Creighton. So Arizona, Baylor, and Creighton are all really close together to each other in my power rankings in this 8th of the bracket. So again, this is pretty close to a coin flip here. And that would be if they face Arizona. Now, Arizona, there certainly is opportunity for them to lose, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But if they do play Arizona, they get a kind of a weaker 2 seed here. So I'd have Creighton pretty much even money here versus Arizona as well, but we'll definitely get plus money on this one. So how are we playing Creighton? In the first round against NC State, I'm going to take Creighton on the spread, -5 against NC State. That way we're not laying significant minus money. We want them to cover the spread of -5 in the first round. So if they don't, we count them as out. Even if they win by 1 or 2 or 3, we count them as out per this system because we lost our $25 investment or whatever dollar amount you want to make it. If you want to just do $10 on each team and have $80 invested, That's it. And that's the nice thing about this system. You just lose $80, but it has the potential to turn into, a couple $100, for example. So we're playing Creighton to cover the spread in the first round against NC State. And then we're playing a money line in the second round and money line in the Sweet 16 to make the Elite Eight. All right, that's our first team. Our second team, and this is a double up spot. We are going to take Utah State in that bottom half of the South bracket as well. Utah State is the 10 seed here, and they are one of the most underseeded teams in the whole tournament. They should be a 7 seed per my power rankings. And in their first round matchup, they face Missouri, who is one of the most overseeded teams. Missouri should be an 11 seed per my power ratings, which, if you heard that, Utah State should be a 7, Missouri should be an 11. I have Utah State favored in this matchup. And, odds makers do have Utah State favored, but they have them at about a 1 to a 1.5 point favorite. I have Utah State as a 3-point favorite here. So we're getting significant value here, a 1.5 or even up to 2 points, depending, where you get your odds. So this is a very good spot for Utah State. We can still play them on the money line because it is close enough to a coin flip. It might be like minus 120, minus 125 or something like that. But that's enough because they'll be an underdog most likely in their later games that I'm totally cool with, playing a money line in the first round game. If they do get past Missouri in the first round, they are likely to face Arizona. As we talked about, Arizona is a 2 seed that grades out more like a 3 seed. Also, there's no regional advantage for Arizona by playing in Sacramento. Utah State is close enough to Sacramento, Arizona close enough to Sacramento, that we're not really talking about traveling across the country or anything like that. Arizona is also not a good free throw shooting team. So if they are ahead, there is potential for them to miss some free throws and give Utah State a couple opportunities there in a late close game. Arizona also not great at defending the 3, which is Utah State's strength. So this increases the variance, which is exactly what we want from an underdog in this spot. Utah State is the 11th best 3-point percentage shooting team in the nation, and they attempt 42% of their field goals from 3 compared to a national average of 37.3%. So they're not only good at making threes, but they're launching them left and right. Meanwhile, Arizona allows just over a third of the points scored against them by way of the 3 ball compared to a 30.8% national average. That's like 3% above the national average. So definitely an increased variance spot here for Utah State. Going into the Sweet 16, if they advance past the second round here, they would get that potential Baylor Creighton, eighth or quarter of the bracket there, I should say. And while those aren't ideal matchups, Baylor and Creighton are both pretty strong. We do have the fact that if they do face Creighton, we get to cash out. So that's great. Now, if they face Baylor, in particular, Baylor has been very lucky. At the Action Network, I do something called our luck rankings for the NFL. Well, Ken Pomeroy at kenpom.com has luck rankings for NCAA basketball, and Baylor has been incredibly lucky with their win-loss percentage, despite having double-digit losses. So there's a very real opportunity that they could beat Baylor here if they do face Baylor. Baylor especially has had some inconsistent play from Adam Flagler. I noticed when Adam Flagler has had some down games, Baylor has tended to lose. And you know why I know that? Because I've bet on Adam Flagler's overs and some player props a few times, and he's let me down every single time. So I'm very personally attuned to that situation there. So overall, how are we playing Utah State? We're just going to play a money line all the way up to the Sweet 16. Hopefully we can cash out that Utah State Creighton opportunity here. But if Utah State faces somebody other than Creighton, we're just going to money line them all the way to the Elite Eight. So that gets us through the South region. We have 2 picks overall from the South region. We're not picking anything from the top half. So let's move on now to the Midwest region. I really think this Midwest region on the top half is kind of tough because we do have Houston, who I have as the #1 overall team in my power rankings, but I think there's an angle here. So my third pick is going to be from that top half of the Midwest region. I'm going to take the 12 seed Drake. Drake is the strongest 12 seed in this bracket for me, and I don't think it's a question here. They're definitely the strongest 12 seed. You could make an argument for Charleston, but my power ratings have Drake a full point better than Charleston in a neutral matchup should the two teams ever face off. In the first round, Drake will face Miami, and Miami is the weakest 5 seed here. So we get the strongest 12 versus the weakest 5. And we all know how those 5-12 matchups go, right? It always seems like every year is at least 1 or 2 12 seeds winning. This is my pick for the best 12-5 upset. My power ratings make Miami closer to 1.5 to 2 point favorite rather than the 2.5 points the market is making Miami. So I actually have Drake a little more likely to win than the market is making. So definitely a great money line play here. We're going to get plus odds on Drake to win this matchup. If they do beat Miami, they would, if things go according to plan, face Indiana as the 4 seed here, but Indiana actually grades out closer to a 6 to 7 seed rather than a 4. So again, a week 4 here. So we get a week 5 and a week 4 in this portion of the bracket. So I really like that. We'd get plus money odds against Indiana as well. And if they face Kent State, it's nearly a, not nearly a coin flip. Drake would certainly be favored, but it's close enough to a coin flip where if we play a money line, it would be like minus 125 probably, which is totally fine because we're getting that plus 125 or so versus Miami. So that would even out to be, we just essentially at that point quadruple our money from our initial investment to 4 times that amount should Drake get to the Sweet 16. Now, if they do get to the Sweet 16, Houston is obviously a tough out as the best overall team in my power ratings, but there is one little catch here. Houston plays at a very slow pace. And Drake also plays at a slightly slower pace than national average. So when the two teams face each other, that means we'll have a low possession game, which doesn't give as many possessions for Houston to assert their dominance. Now, if this were an average paced game, I'd have Houston a 12-point favorite, but at the projected pace, Houston would just be about a 10-point favorite. So you can see how that keeps things a little bit closer here. So there's also the possibility with Houston's slow pace of play. Think about Virginia a few years ago when they lost to UMBC in the first round as the 1 seed. There is a possibility Houston is out after the second round, either in the first round or the second round. Now, obviously, probably not the first round, but it's certainly a possibility. I do have that at around a 4% chance. But then they face Iowa or Auburn, who certainly would have a much better opportunity than Northern Texas. So there is a possibility Houston is out just because of the pace of play they play. And then you could get Drake versus maybe an Auburn or an Iowa, where it would be a much better matchup for them. So how are we going to play Drake here? We're going to money line them to the Sweet 16. If they beat, and it has to be this exact scenario, if they beat both Miami and if they beat Indiana, so not if they play Kent State, but if they beat Miami and they beat Indiana, we can cash out if they play Houston, not if they play another team, but if they play Houston. So this exact scenario, if they beat Miami and they beat Indiana, then they play Houston, we will cash them out there at the Sweet 16 instead of rolling them to the Elite 8. Otherwise, we're going to money line them to the Elite 8 in any other scenario. Like, for example, if they play Kent State in the second round, or if they play Iowa or Auburn in the Sweet 16, then we'll just money line Drake all the way to the Elite 8. So that's how I'm going to play the third pick here, Drake. Going to the other side of the Midwest, I'm going to take Mississippi State, and they're the 11 seed. And this is the situation I'm talking about here. They're in the play-in game. So, I think this is a nice spot because we don't need to get them to the Elite 8 where they could potentially face, a tougher team like Texas. All we need to do is get them to the Sweet 16 to be profitable here. I have Mississippi State as the second best 11th seed in this tournament, and they are playing one of the worst 11 seeds in Pittsburgh. And in this spot, I have them favored over Pittsburgh. So what we'll do here, because this is close enough, we can just money line them in this game versus Pittsburgh. We don't necessarily have to take them to cover the spread here. So we're gonna take Mississippi State over Pittsburgh because I have Mississippi State as the better 11 seed here. Then in the first round, if Mississippi State wins, they will play Iowa State. And this is the coolest potentially one of the coolest games in NCAA tournament history if this happens. These two teams may combine for one of the lowest totals all time in, past couple decades. I shouldn't say all time because, different shot clock eras, but in the current shot clock configuration, this may be one of the lowest totals of all time in the tournament. We've got two incredibly slow-paced teams. Out of 363 teams, Iowa State and Mississippi State would rank 326th and 334th in pace of play. We also have two top 8 defenses, 6th and 8th best in defensive efficiency per KenPom. And then we have two mediocre offenses. If we just look at the at-large teams, these are two of the bottom 3 teams in offense efficiency. So that means we're getting a really low-scoring game here. And when that happens, a slow-paced, low-scoring game, this game could go either way. I actually think while I do have, Iowa State favored by about a point here, I really, truly think this is a coin flip of a game. Iowa State is a bad 6 seed. I actually have them as an 8 seed. So this is an ideal situation for Mississippi State against Iowa State. Then if they win that in the second round, they would play Xavier. Xavier's a weak 3 seed. I have them almost a 5 seed here. So almost 2 seeds. They're like borderline 4-5 here. And Xavier, of course, is without Zach Fremantle. He's missed about the past 10 games or so. So definitely getting a week 6 and a week 3 is a great spot for an 11 seed. We're going to money line them all the way to the Sweet 16. And we could even make a decision if they're in the Sweet 16 and they face, let's say, Texas A&M or Penn State, or Colgate, I guess, although I don't foresee Colgate making the Sweet 16. But if they face Texas A&M or Penn State, we could even money line them all the way to the Elite 8 if we want to. Or if you're happy with cashing out your profits, you can cash out your profits. I wouldn't money line them to the Elite 8 if they did face Texas, though. I have Texas much better here. All right, so that completes the Midwest region. We have 4 picks under our belt. Let's go to the West region where, because this is an absolutely brutal region, I just have 1 pick from the West. Remember, I said we're avoiding the UCLA Gonzaga 8th of the bracket. We talked about that, the best 2 and the best 3 seed and no really strong underdogs. So instead, we're going to look at the Kansas half of the bracket. And I personally am going to go with Arkansas. I think you could go with Illinois here. I think you could go with VCU here. I think you could go with UConn here. I know I try to take 5 seeds or longer, but I think you could maybe take UConn to cover the spread in the first round and then money line them after that if you wanted to. This is an incredibly loaded portion of the bracket, but I am going to pick Arkansas simply because they are one of my most underseeded teams in the whole bracket, even more so than UConn, even more so than St. Mary's, VCU. And I think St. Mary's is a little underseeded, and I do have them as a strong 5 seed, but VCU matches up really well with St. Mary's. So despite St. Mary's strength here, I think VCU is a very difficult matchup for them, which means Connecticut facing VCU, UConn will be favored quite heavily there. So I'm avoiding that Connecticut St. Mary's VCU spot because I don't like VCU versus Connecticut. So that's why I'm sticking this 8-9 matchup, Arkansas versus Illinois. Arkansas, I have as the better team here, so I'm just going to take them. Now, I know the market also has Arkansas, so if you wanted to take Illinois here, totally not opposed to that. I do have Illinois actually technically as a better value in the matchup versus Arkansas on the money line when you compare, what their win probability is based off of the implied odds you're getting on the money line to, what the market is offering and versus what my power ratings say. But I think Arkansas has more upside because I do have them as the better team. And Arkansas also is in a spot where they are up tempo. So I do think that little bit of up-tempo-ness will help them push that efficiency versus Illinois. So I'm going to take them here. And if they do beat Arkansas, they would almost surely get Kansas, who is a pretty weak 1 seed. I have Kansas as a lower 2 seed actually in my power ratings. Kansas I have as the 7th best team in this tournament in my power ratings. So a really nice spot to get Kansas, where I think they have a good chance to upset Kansas. So we would definitely get plus money there. And then should they upset Kansas, they get, Connecticut, St. Mary's, VCU. Very tough here. But the one thing is, if they do get UConn, who I have UConn as a borderline 1-2 seed. I love UConn in this tournament, and I think it's a great spot. I just don't think UConn is in a great spot for this system. It still should be a very competitive game for Arkansas and UConn has underperformed, as has Arkansas. That's why they're both seated where they are. They're better than their results have showed. But, this is a spot where Arkansas, they push tempo, and UConn is a slower team in the slower portion of the teams, that they could potentially face. So that does help the fact that UConn's a little slower. So the teams that are better than Arkansas in this portion of the bracket play really slow. St. Mary's also plays really slow should they end up facing St. Mary's. So I think this is a good spot for Arkansas because they get some slower teams potentially in that 4-5 matchup should they make the Sweet 16. So the way to play Arkansas is just money line them the whole time, because even though they're favored versus Illinois, it's not a huge favorite, and we'll definitely make that up with the matchup against Kansas and then the matchup against either UConn or St. Mary's most likely. So that's it for the West region. We're not even doubling up here. We just have that one pick because this is an absolutely brutal region. So our final 3 picks are all going to come from the South region. And there's a lot of goodness here. We've got Purdue as the weakest 1 seed. We've got Marquette as the weakest 2 seed. We've got Kansas State as the weakest 3 seed. So this is a really, really good opportunity to pick some underdogs in the South. And that's why we have 3 picks here. We're going to have a double up spot as well. But in the top half of this bracket, the Purdue half of the bracket, I'm going to take Florida Atlantic. I definitely understand if you want to take Memphis as well. But I'm going to take Florida Atlantic mainly because I think this is just a spot where the market is overcorrecting here for Memphis. I have Florida Atlantic as the best 9 seed. They should be an 8 seed. And while I think Memphis is a very good 8 seed, again, it's just all about value in this matchup. And I think the matchup itself kind of sets up well. Florida Atlantic is a great 3-point shooting team, and Memphis allows a 42.9% 3-point attempt ratio per total field goals. So 42.9% of the field goals attempted against Memphis are 3-pointers. That's 31st highest in the nation. That's going to increase variance for the underdog Florida Atlantic here. So again, I definitely don't mind if you roll with Memphis here. They're a strong 8 seed. I'm playing Florida Atlantic because I have Memphis as a at most 1.5 point favorite, and the market is giving us 2.5 points on Florida Atlantic. So that means even on the money line, we're getting better value here. So I'm going to take Florida Atlantic just for the value here. But I could see, if you want to go different for me here, I could definitely see you wanting to take Memphis. In the second round, they get Purdue, who I mentioned is the worst 1 seed. And Purdue, that's nice because even though they're the more efficient team, they play at a super plodding pace, which is awesome. And between Memphis, another reason I like Florida Atlantic, between Memphis and Florida Atlantic themselves are the slower paced team. So we'd really keep the possessions down here to about 65.5 possessions versus a 67.5 almost national average between Purdue and Florida Atlantic. Then on to the Sweet 16. If things go according to plan, Florida Atlantic would get either Duke or Tennessee. Tennessee, the 4 seed, and Duke, the 5 seed. And I do have Tennessee as a very strong 4 seed, but the problem is Tennessee is suffering a little bit of injury issue here. Zakai Ziegler is out, and he is the guy that, has contributed so much to this team, one of their best players. So you have to knock them down for that for sure. And then, obviously Duke, they're barely favored over Florida Atlantic in my power ratings, but because of all the national love for Duke, we actually get Florida Atlantic probably at a decent plus money price here. So I think this is a good spot to just take Florida Atlantic. I think this is, of all of these, I think this is one that is arguably the most questionable, but it also, I think, has a lot of the most value. So I think this is a good spot to take Florida Atlantic. Certainly don't mind if you take Memphis. I don't even mind if you take Duke, as long as you take them spread in the first round and then money line them if they play Tennessee. But I do think with Tennessee's injury concerns, there's a chance Duke plays Oral Roberts and then plays Louisiana. And I don't love that spot because it wouldn't necessarily, we'd have to have Duke cover the spread then in the Louisiana game as well. So I don't want to do that. I'd rather just do the money line system, give us a much higher upside here in terms of our total units won, in terms of our total dollars won, and roll with Florida Atlantic. All right, on to my 7th pick. I'm going to take Providence. We're going to the bottom half now. This is the double up spot. We're going to pick two teams from this bottom half of the East region. I'm going to take Providence as the 11 seed. I have them as the best overall 11th seed. They really should be a 10 seed. And while they do have a tough matchup in the first round against Kentucky, I've got this line at 2.5 tops instead of the 4 that you can currently get. So Kentucky really should only be a 2.5 point favorite, not a 4-point favorite. That means same is going to apply to the money line. We're going to get better plus odds on Providence than they probably should be. So Providence and Kentucky, they also both play at slower paces, which will help keep the overall possessions down, reducing the opportunity for Kentucky to assert their efficiency advantage. And this really reminds me of Vanderbilt versus Kentucky. Vanderbilt won both of their matchups versus Kentucky this year. Very similar paces of play between Vandy and Providence, very similar offensive and defensive efficiencies between Vandy and Providence. So I think this is a situation where Providence, could surprise Kentucky a little bit. Providence, a pretty decent 3-point shooting team as well, which helps increase that variance. So I'm going to roll with Providence here, although I do like Kentucky in the system as well. You could take them to money line or cover the spread versus Providence. Pick your poison there, because that 3 seed matchup in the second round is really good versus Kansas State. Should it be Kansas State? Now, if it's not Kansas State, it's going to be Montana State, and that's fine because Providence isn't going to be a monstrous favorite versus Montana State. They'll be a favorite, but I think it's an opportunity where we could potentially just take Providence on to cover the spread there. Could potentially still money line them, depending on what's happening with Marquette, for example. If Marquette is still alive, we could money line Providence even versus Montana State. But we'll play it out. We'll see how it goes. But Kansas State, by far the worst 3 seed. So if Providence does face Kansas State, I think this is a really good situation. Kansas State is a borderline 5 or 6 seed per my power rating. So, we're getting what is a decent, borderline 5-6 seed for Kentucky. And then we're getting a borderline 5-6 seed versus Kansas State when they're actually a 3 seed. So I think we're going to get some nice value there as well on Providence money line. Then if they make the Sweet 16, they would get the worst 2 seed in Marquette. And there's a good chance they don't even have to play Marquette. They could play somebody with a better shot to beat, like Michigan State or USC, or even maybe Vermont as the 15 seed. So really good situation for Providence should they get past Kentucky. So we're going to money line Providence all the way to the Elite 8. No matter who they play, even if they end up playing Montana State, I think we probably were just going to moneyline them there. I guess the only way we wouldn't is if somehow the favorites kind of chalk out here and they face Montana State. But even then, probably still moneyline them. All right, on to our final pick for the Giffen Guide to March Madness. And again, another one I struggled with here. I could definitely see Michigan State being the one here, but I'm going to go with USC as the 10 seed here instead of Michigan State. But I like Providence, I like Kentucky, I like Michigan State, and I like UNC or USC Southern Cal here because I think Marquette is just so weak and Kansas State is so weak. You could pick your favorites from this eighth of the bracket, and hopefully they end up meeting each other in the Sweet 16, right? So hopefully I'm getting Providence to meet whoever it is that I pick, and I'm picking USC as the 10 seed here. I have USC as a borderline 9 or 10 seed, so a very good 10 seed. And they're facing Michigan State in this first round. And I do have this as a coin flip at a neutral venue. I mean, these two teams are so close in my power ratings, maybe Michigan by 0.5 point here. But I essentially have them as a coin flip in a neutral site. Now, this is kind of a semi-home game for Michigan State, as it will be in Columbus, Ohio, and USC is going to have to travel all the way to Columbus, but it just makes it a semi-home, which isn't enough to make Michigan State kind of a home court advantage. Plus, it's not their home court, so there's just some things you kind of have to get used to of it being a different court, being away from home. So it's just semi-home. So I don't have that as quite enough an advantage to get Michigan State to a 2-point favorite. So there is a little bit of value on USC on the money line here. Should they get past Michigan State? Again, really like them facing Marquette, worst 2 seed, and also a chance, Marquette loses to Vermont. But even then, I have Marquette as the worst 2 seed, so we can take USC money line there. And then again, they'd face Kentucky, Providence, or Kansas State. And I think all of those are totally fine opportunities for USC. They'd be at worst a coin flip to some of these teams, and definitely a plus money line dog here. So we're just going to money line them all the way to the Elite Eight, unless, of course, they face Providence. So that is the Giffen Guide to March Madness. 8 teams, 8 picks, 8 hopefully Cinderella stories. In fact, the only real non-favorite we picked is, I guess, technically Arkansas as an 8 seed, and then Creighton as a 6 seed in that first game. But overall, we're picking some underdogs. We got some Cinderella stories to root for. We're going to limit our losses to 2 units with the potential for some great upside. So I hope you all enjoy March Madness. Thank you for listening to the Giffen Guide to March Madness presented by FanDuel.